They say diamonds are a girl's best friend, but nobody ever warned me that sometimes your worst enemy comes disguised as family. Growing up as Margaret Chen in Palo Alto, I learned early that love in our house was conditional, doled out like prizes at a competition where my sister Victoria always seemed to know the rules and I was perpetually playing catch-up. While she collected achievements like trophies, Stanford economics degree, Goldman Sachs analyst position, that magazine perfect smile that commanded every room, I was the quieter sister, the one who chose computers over cocktail parties, substance over sparkle. What my family saw as settling for less was actually me building something extraordinary in secret, but appearances had always mattered more than truth in the Chen household. The simple platinum ring on my finger looked like sentiment and nostalgia, a grandmother's keepsake from someone who understood that real value doesn't announce itself to the world. 29 years of being underestimated had taught me patience, but patience has limits, especially when your sister decides your life story needs editing for her perfect narrative. What Victoria didn't understand about quiet people is that we're not hiding from attention, we're choosing our moments carefully. And sometimes when the moment is right, when the stakes are high enough and the audience is large enough, quiet people can make the loudest statements of all. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating Victoria's engagement to Brandon. Wellington 4, old money Mayflower lineage, everything Mom had ever dreamed of for her golden daughter. But as I sat at our family dinner table, twisting the ring that held more secrets than anyone in that room could imagine, I couldn't shake the feeling that some revelations were inevitable. Some truths demand their day in the sun, no matter how carefully you've kept them in the shadows. Tonight, that moment had finally arrived. The moment Victoria held up her left hand to show off the 3-carat Cartier diamond, I found myself unconsciously twisting the thin platinum band on my own finger. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious if we'd planned it that way. Mom gasped like she was witnessing the second coming. She actually pressed her hand to her chest and said, "Oh my goodness," 3 times in a row before launching into rapid-fire Mandarin that roughly translated to, "This is the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to our family in the history of families." Victoria beamed under the attention, her perfectly straight blonde hair catching the dining room light as she angled her hand for maximum sparkle effect. At 32, she'd mastered the art of making every moment about her, and tonight was no exception. The Wellington family, she announced breathlessly, could trace their lineage back to the Mayflower. Brandon's great-great-grandfather had been a railroad baron. They summered in the Hamptons and had a box at the Metropolitan Opera. Dad nodded politely from his spot at the head of our modest Palo Alto dining table, the one Mom had bought at a garage sale 15 years ago and refinished herself. He was proud, I could tell, but also slightly overwhelmed by the sudden elevation in what he considered our family's social status. David Chen, immigrant success story, watching his eldest daughter marry into American aristocracy. I kept twisting my ring, the one that looked so simple compared to Victoria's flashy engagement announcement. Plain platinum setting, understated stone. The kind of piece that whispered rather than screamed. Grandma Grace's ring had been on my finger for 6 years now, ever since I turned 23 and she'd pressed it into my palm during her final hospital stay. For the granddaughter who understands that real value isn't always visible, she'd written in the note tucked into the velvet box. If only she could see us now. Brandon Wellington IV sat beside Victoria looking every inch the part of old money privilege. Tall blonde Harvard MBA, the kind of jaw that appeared on investment firm brochures. He worked in private equity, which Mom kept confusing with private banking, but the distinction didn't matter to her. What mattered was the Wellington name and everything it represented. "Your sister is so accomplished," Mom said, switching back to English and beaming at Victoria. "Goldman Sachs now marrying into such a distinguished family. We're so blessed." I managed a smile and reached for my water glass. 29 years old, and I was still the footnote in Victoria's success story. The computer science degree from Stanford somehow counted for less than her economics degree from the same school. My work in tech was dismissed as playing with gadgets, while her career in investment banking was treated like she'd discovered a cure for cancer. "Tell them about the venue," Victoria prompted Brandon, who launched into descriptions of the Auberge du Soleil in Napa Valley. 200 guests, Victoria added with the kind of casual precision that meant she'd rehearsed this moment. Spring wedding, of course. "The vineyard views will be absolutely stunning for photos." Uncle Robert looked up from his mostly untouched plate of Mom's weekend dim sum. Dad's younger brother had always been the quiet observer in our family, content to let others dominate conversations while he absorbed every detail. His patent law practice had made him wealthy in his own right, but he wore success like a comfortable old sweater rather than a billboard. "That sounds lovely," he said to Victoria, then turned to me with genuine interest. And what about you? Margaret, how's your startup coming along? The question caught me off guard, the way Uncle Robert's questions always did. While everyone else in the family treated my work like an amusing hobby, he actually seemed to want real answers. Oh, I said, falling back on my standard deflection. Still plugging away at the tech thing. Nothing as exciting as Victoria's news. But what exactly does your company do? Uncle Robert pressed gently. I've heard you mention artificial intelligence and logistics, but I'd love to understand more about the technical side. I felt Victoria's eyes on me, that familiar weight of comparison settling across the table. Chen Morrison Technologies was indeed working on revolutionary AI platforms that would transform supply chain management, but explaining that would require revealing things I wasn't ready to share. Like the fact that our Series C funding round had valued the company at nearly $500 million, or that James Morrison, my co-founder and secret husband of 6 months, was featured on the cover of Forbes as one of their 40 under 40. It's complicated, I said, twisting the ring again. Just some machine learning applications for shipping and inventory management. Uncle Robert's eyes lingered on my face for a moment longer than necessary, and I got the distinct impression he was filing away my evasiveness for later consideration. But he simply nodded and said, well, I'm sure you're building something important. Innovation often happens quietly before the world notices. Victoria had been checking her phone throughout Uncle Robert's questions, her attention already moving past my boring technical work to scroll through what I assumed were congratulatory messages from friends and colleagues. The Goldman Sachs network was probably lighting up with excitement about her engagement to Brandon Wellington IV, the kind of match that elevated everyone's social currency by association. She looked up from her screen with a slight frown. Actually, I should mention something about wedding planning. The Wellingtons have very specific expectations about family presentations. Victoria's voice carried that particular tone she used when she was about to deliver criticism disguised as helpful advice. Mom immediately straightened, ready to receive whatever guidance Victoria might offer about properly representing the family at such an important social event. It's nothing major, Victoria continued, but we'll need everyone to look their absolute best. The photography alone will cost more than most people's entire wedding budgets, and these photos will be in the society pages, maybe even Vogue if Brandon's mother's connections come through. Her gaze landed on me specifically. Margaret, I was thinking you might want to consider updating your wardrobe. Something more sophisticated than your usual Target aesthetic. And maybe do something with your hair. The Wellington family photographer specializes in elegant portraits, so we'll want to make sure everyone photographs well. The criticism hit exactly where Victoria intended, that soft spot between my ribs where decades of comparison had worn the skin thin. I nodded and said, of course I want your day to be perfect. Because what else could I say? That my closet actually contained designer, pieces worth more than her annual salary, that I could afford any photographer, any venue, any wedding she could dream of instead. I twisted Grandma Grace's $2 million Art Deco ring and let my sister continue planning what she was convinced would be the social event of the season. Victoria had no idea that her little sister's simple life was anything but simple, and I wasn't ready to enlighten her, not yet. But as Uncle Robert caught my eye across the table and gave me the slightest, encouraging nod, I wondered how much longer I could maintain the facade. Some secrets I was beginning to realize had expiration dates. The view from our penthouse terrace stretched across San Francisco Bay like a living postcard, the city lights beginning to twinkle as evening settled over the water. James stood beside me, his arm around my waist as we watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. In 3 hours, I'd drive my beat-up Honda Civic back to my childhood bedroom in Palo Alto, where I'd pretend to be the family disappointment who worked at some little startup nobody had ever heard of. The contrast never stopped feeling surreal. How was dinner with the family, James asked, his voice carrying that particular combination of affection and concern I'd grown to love over our 6 years together. His dark hair was still slightly mussed from running his hands through it during what I knew had been a marathon day of investor meetings. Victoria announced her engagement to Brandon Wellington, I said, unconsciously touching Grandma Grace's ring. Mom practically fainted from excitement. Old money Mayflower ancestry, the whole package. James turned to study my face with those impossibly blue eyes that had first caught my attention in our Stanford computer science lab. At 35, he'd learned to read my moods better than I could read them myself. And how do you feel about that? Honestly relieved. It means she'll be so focused on planning the perfect society wedding that she won't have time to analyze my life choices. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Your life choices seem to be working out pretty well. The latest revenue projections came in today. We're tracking to hit 800 million in valuation by the IPO launch. The numbers still didn't feel real. Even after 6 years of building Chen Morrison Technologies from a dorm room, idea into what Forbes had called the most disruptive logistics platform of the decade. Maybe it was the way I compartmentalized my life, keeping my family relationships completely separate from the world where I was, co-founder and CEO of a company that would soon make us both billionaires. My phone buzzed with the text from Uncle Robert. I had a wonderful time at dinner tonight. I would love to take you to lunch this week and hear more about your work. Something told me he wasn't buying my casual deflections about the tech thing. I showed the message to James, who raised an eyebrow. Your uncle seems more perceptive than the rest of your family. He's always been different. Patent attorney actually listens when people talk. Doesn't assume he knows everything about my life based on the car I drive. Speaking of which, James said with a grin, when are you going to let me buy you something that doesn't require a prayer? Every time you start the engine, never. That Honda is my cover story. Besides, I've grown fond of the way Victoria cringes every time I pull into their driveway. We'd had this conversation countless times over the years. James came from a family where success was celebrated openly, where his mother Eleanor called to congratulate him on every Forbes mention, and his father displayed magazine covers in his study like proud parent trophies. The Morrisons had never understood why I insisted on keeping our marriage secret from my own family. But they respected my choice, especially after they'd witnessed the Chen family dynamics firsthand during our courthouse wedding in January. Judge Patricia Wong, a family friend of the Morrisons, had officiated while Maya Patel served as our only witness. The ceremony had been necessary for legal protection when a competitor tried to launch a hostile takeover of our company, but it was also the most romantic moment of my life precisely because it was just about us. No performance, no family drama, no competition for attention. Just two people who'd built something beautiful together, both professionally and personally choosing to make it official. The IPO process has been more stressful than I expected, I admitted, leaning into James's warmth. All the media attention, the investor meetings, the constant scrutiny of every business decision we've made for the past 6 years. Are you having second thoughts about going public? No. But I'm having second thoughts about how much longer I can keep this from my family. Victoria's wedding is going to be crawling with tech industry people. Half of our investor network will probably be there as Wellington family friends. James was quiet for a moment, considering. What if we just tell them, your parents, your sister, everyone? Get it over with before the wedding. The thought made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. You don't understand what it's like being the disappointing daughter for 29 years. If I suddenly reveal that I'm actually more successful than Victoria, it won't feel like vindication. It'll feel like I've been lying to them this whole time. Haven't you been? The question stung because it was fair. I had been lying by omission, if not by outright deception. But the alternative felt impossible to navigate. How do you tell a family that spent decades treating you as the underachiever that you're actually worth more than all of them combined? Phone rang, interrupting my spiral of family guilt. Maya's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with relief at the distraction. Please tell me you're not still obsessing over Victoria's engagement announcement, she said without preamble. Maya Patel had been my best friend since freshman year at Stanford, the one person outside of James who knew the full scope of my double life. I'm trying not to, but Uncle Robert wants to have lunch and talk about my work. I think he's getting suspicious. Good. Maybe it's time someone in your family actually saw you for who you are, instead of who they think you should be. Easy for you to say. Your parents threw you a party when you got promoted to marketing director at Tesla. My parents also didn't spend my entire childhood comparing me to a perfect older sister who made me feel like everything I achieved was somehow lesser by default. Maya had a point, as she usually did, but she also hadn't grown up in a house where every conversation somehow circled back to Victoria's latest accomplishment, where academic achievements were ranked by perceived prestige rather than actual difficulty, where choosing passion over profit was seen as evidence of impractical dreaming. James squeezed my hand, drawing my attention back to the present moment. Whatever you decide about your family, you know I'll support you. But Margaret, you can't live 2 separate lives forever. The stress is starting to show. He was right, and we both knew it. The compartmentalization that had once felt protective now felt exhausting. Every family dinner required careful deflection. Every phone call with my mother involved strategic subject changes. Every interaction with Victoria meant swallowing my frustration at being treated like the family charity case. But revealing the truth felt like crossing a line I couldn't cross. Once my family knew about Chen Morrison Technologies, about James, about the penthouse and the private jet and the Forbes covers, everything would change. The question was whether it would change for better or worse. As if reading my thoughts, James said quietly, "Your grandmother's ring has been keeping your secret for almost a century. Maybe it's time to let it tell its real story." I looked down at the simple platinum band, thinking about Grace Chen and the empire she'd built in San Francisco's Chinatown during the 1920s. An immigrant woman who'd started with nothing and created something extraordinary, all while wearing this understated symbol of her success. She'd understood that real value didn't need to announce itself. But she'd also left me a note about understanding invisible worth, and I was beginning to wonder if invisibility had become less about humility and more about hiding. The sun had fully set now, leaving the city sparkling below us like a circuit board. Tomorrow I'd drive the Honda back to Palo Alto for Uncle Robert's lunch invitation, and I'd have to decide how much truth I was ready to reveal. The bridal salon at Neiman Marcus was supposed to be a sanctuary of elegance, all soft lighting and champagne flutes, where brides-to-be had magical moments surrounded by loved ones. Instead, I found myself standing on a pedestal in an ill-fitting bridesmaid dress while Victoria critiqued my body to a complete stranger. "Can you do something about her midsection?" Victoria asked the seamstress, gesturing at me like I was a mannequin that couldn't hear. "She's always been this bigger one in the family. Maybe some strategic tucking or a different cut that hides the problem areas." The seamstress, a middle-aged woman named Rosa who'd probably seen every kind of family drama, looked uncomfortable but professional. "We can certainly adjust the fit to be more flattering," she said diplomatically. "And what about her shoulders? They're so broad compared to mine." Victoria continued her assessment while I stood motionless, staring at my reflection in the three-way mirror. The other customers in the salon had started glancing over, drawn by Victoria's increasingly loud commentary. "Ma'am," Rosa said quietly, "perhaps we could discuss alterations privately." "It's fine," Victoria waved dismissively. "Margaret doesn't mind. We've always been honest about these things in our family." She turned to me with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Right, Maggie. You want the dress to look as good as possible for the photos." I managed to nod, my throat too tight for words. The nickname Maggie felt like another small humiliation, reducing me to something smaller and less significant than my actual name. Victoria had been like this for 3 weeks now, ever since she'd started serious wedding planning. The venue at Auberge du Soleil cost $150,000 for the day. Her custom Vera Wang dress came with a $25,000 price tag. The flower arrangements alone would cost more than most people spent on their entire wedding, but the money wasn't what bothered me most. It was the way Victoria had started editing our family's social circle, deciding who was sophisticated enough to witness her transformation into Mrs. Brandon Wellington Fort. "Mrs. Patterson can't come," she'd announced at last Sunday's family dinner, referring to my favorite high school teacher who'd encouraged me to apply to Stanford. "She's sweet, but she's just a public school teacher. The Wellingtons will be bringing judges and investment bankers. We need to maintain a certain standard." I'd wanted to point out that Mrs. Patterson had shaped more young minds than most of Victoria's Goldman Sachs colleagues ever would, but the words died in my throat when I saw Mom nodding in agreement. "Of course, sweetie. We want everything to be perfect for your special day." The dress fitting continued with Victoria directing Rosa through a series of adjustments designed to minimize what she saw as my physical shortcomings. By the time we finished, I felt like I'd been dissected and reassembled into something more palatable for Victoria's vision of family perfection. As we walked to the parking garage, Uncle Robert appeared seemingly from nowhere, carrying shopping bags from the Apple store upstairs. He'd been visiting their Genius Bar, he explained, having trouble with his iPad after the latest software update. "How did the dress fitting go?" he asked pleasantly, but I caught something in his expression when he looked at my face. "Wonderfully," Victoria answered before I could respond. "Rosa is such an artist with difficult figures. She'll make Margaret look almost elegant for the photos." Uncle Robert's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sure Margaret will look beautiful regardless. She has our grandmother's bone structure." It was such a simple comment, but it felt like a lifeline. Someone in our family had just suggested I might be naturally beautiful rather than requiring extensive alterations to appear acceptable. Victoria's phone buzzed with what seemed like the 100th notification of the day. Her social media had exploded since the engagement announcement, with Stanford alumni and Goldman Sachs colleagues offering congratulations and asking about wedding details. After she walked ahead to answer a call, Uncle Robert fell into step beside me. "Your sister seems stressed about the wedding planning." "It's a big event," I said carefully. "She wants everything to be perfect." "Perfectionism can be exhausting," Uncle Robert observed, "for everyone involved." He paused at his car, a modest Prius that he drove despite being able to afford anything he wanted. "Margaret, you know you deserve to be treated with kindness by your family. Right, success or no success, wedding or no wedding. Basic human decency isn't conditional. His words hit something deep in my chest, a place I'd been protecting for so long, I'd almost forgotten it existed. Nobody in my family had ever said anything like that to me. The idea that I deserved kindness simply for being myself, not for achieving specific milestones or meeting certain standards, felt revolutionary. Before I could respond, Victoria returned from her phone call looking simultaneously elated and stressed. That was the photographer, she announced. He wants to do a family portrait session before the ceremony, something that captures our journey from humble immigrant family to American success story. Won't that be amazing for the wedding album? She was already envisioning the composition, I could tell. Victoria in her Vera Wang masterpiece, Brandon in his custom tuxedo, and the rest of us arranged around them like supporting characters in the story of her triumph. My phone rang as we reached our cars. Eleanor Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and I felt a familiar warmth at seeing it. James's mother had become the closest thing to a mother-in-law I'd ever imagined having, despite the fact that our marriage remained secret from my own family. "I'll catch up with you later," I told Victoria, who was already absorbed in wedding venue logistics on her phone. Eleanor's voice was warm and concerned when I answered. "Margaret, darling, how are you holding up? James mentioned Victoria's wedding is coming up soon." "Surviving," I said, walking to a quieter corner of the parking garage. "She's in full bridezilla mode, but it's manageable. You know, if you need any support during the wedding, I'd be happy to attend. I realize we can't exactly introduce me as your mother-in-law, but perhaps as a family friend. Sometimes having an ally in the room can make difficult family dynamics more bearable." The offer was so thoughtful, so different from the conditional support I was used to, that I felt tears prick my eyes. The Morrisons had shown me what healthy family relationships looked like, where love wasn't rationed based on achievement levels and support didn't come with strings attached. "That's really kind of you, Eleanor. Let me think about it. Of course, take your time. But Margaret, remember that you deserve to be celebrated, not tolerated. You've built something extraordinary, and anyone who can't see that is missing out on knowing a remarkable woman." After we hung up, I sat in my Honda for several minutes, thinking about the contrast between Eleanor's unconditional acceptance and the way my own family treated me like a project that needed constant improvement. Victoria tapped on my window, making me jump. I rolled it down to find her looking impatient. "Are you coming to Mom and Dad's for dinner? She wants to go over the seating chart for the reception." "I'll be there in a few minutes," I said. "Good. And Margaret, try to be more enthusiastic about wedding plannings. Okay, this is the biggest thing that's ever happened to our family. I need you to be supportive, not sulking about dress fittings." As she walked away, I realized that Victoria genuinely believed her own narrative. In her mind, I was the jealous little sister who couldn't appreciate her success, rather than someone who'd been systematically diminished for decades. She'd created an entire mythology around our relationship that cast her as the patient, successful sister dealing with my inadequacies and resentments. The scary part was how easily our family had accepted that story. How readily they believed that my quiet nature meant I was bitter, that my different choices meant I was failing, that my privacy meant I had nothing worth celebrating. But Uncle Robert had seen something different today, and Eleanor Morrison saw something different every time we talked. Maybe it was time to stop letting Victoria's version of me be the only one that existed. Uncle Robert's call came while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office, the numbers blurring together as my mind wandered to Victoria's increasingly erratic wedding preparations. His voice carried an unusual gravity when I answered. "Margaret, do you have a few minutes to talk? It's about your sister's fiancé." I set down my pen, immediately alert. "What about Brandon?" "I attended a finance industry dinner last night in the city." The Wellington family name came up in conversation with a colleague who handles corporate restructuring. The information he shared was concerning enough that I felt you should know. Uncle Robert had always been careful with words, precise in the way that successful patent attorneys learn to be. If he was calling about Brandon, it wasn't idle gossip. What kind of information? The Wellington family lost approximately $200 million in market volatility last year. Their hedge fund made some very poor investment decisions, and they're currently facing significant financial difficulties. The Newport mansion has multiple mortgages, and they've been quietly selling assets. The yacht, several art pieces, even some of the family jewelry. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Does Victoria know? I doubt it. They're maintaining appearances quite well from what I understand. But Margaret, there's more. My colleague mentioned that Brandon has been specifically targeted in his dating choices recently. There are whispers in certain circles about him seeking partners from what they perceive as wealthy Asian families. The words hit like a physical blow. The stereotype was both insulting and sadly predictable. The assumption that our family had money tucked away, that Asian immigrants were inherently financially successful, that Victoria represented access to some hidden fortune. Are you sure about this? As sure as I can be without seeing their financial statements directly. But Margaret, I've been watching that young man at family gatherings. The questions he asks your parents about the business, the way he assesses the house, the casual inquiries about family investments. It doesn't sit right with me. I thanked Uncle Robert and hung up immediately, calling Maya. She answered on the first ring, sounding slightly out of breath. I was just about to call you, she said without preamble. I've been doing some digging on Brandon Wellington and girl. You need to sit down for this. What did you find? His social media is a masterclass in fake it till you make it. Instagram photos from Vegas every few weeks, always tagged at high-end casinos. Designer watches that cost more than his supposed salary at the private equity firm. And to get this, I found some interesting connections through mutual friends. Maya had always been thorough when she decided to investigate something, a skill that served her well in her marketing career at Tesla. He owes money to some questionable people, she continued. I can't prove it directly, but there are photos of him with guys who definitely aren't in private equity, if you know what I mean. And the gambling thing isn't just weekend fun in Vegas. He's got serious problems, Margaret. The picture was becoming clearer and uglier by the minute. Brandon Wellington IV wasn't just marrying Victoria for social positioning. He was marrying her because he desperately needed what he thought our family could provide. Should I warn Victoria? The question hung in the air while I considered my options. Part of me wanted to protect my sister despite everything, but another part of me remembered the science fair incident from our childhood, when Victoria had publicly dismissed my project as embarrassing and nerdy because it might reflect poorly on her social standing with the popular kids. I was 12 years old, presenting a working model of solar energy conversion that I'd spent months perfecting. Victoria, then 15 and deeply concerned about her image, had loudly announced to anyone who would listen that her little sister was going through an awkward phase and that our parents were probably pushing me too hard academically. The humiliation had been crushing, but the betrayal cut deeper. Victoria had sacrificed my moment of achievement to protect her own social currency, and she'd done it without a moment's hesitation. Maybe it's time she learns to read people's character for herself. I told Maya finally. That's cold but fair. She's been pretty awful to you lately. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Morrison, thinking of you as the wedding approaches. Still happy to attend as moral support if you need a friendly face in the crowd. Eleanor's consistent kindness stood in stark contrast to my own family's conditional affection. The Morrisons had welcomed me without reservation, treating me as a daughter rather than a project that needed improvement. James's mother called to check on me during stressful work weeks, remembered details about my life that my own parents forgot, and offered support without expecting anything in return. The difference was staggering when I allowed myself to acknowledge it. That evening, Victoria called in tears, not the manipulative tears she used for effect, but genuine distress that made her voice sound younger and more vulnerable than I'd heard in years. Margaret, I think I'm having a panic attack. Can you come over? I drove to her apartment in Soma, a sleek high-rise that cost more per month than most people's annual salaries. I found her on her couch, still in her Goldman Sachs work clothes, mascara streaked down her cheeks. I can't do this, she said when I sat beside her. The wedding, Brandon's family, trying to be perfect enough for people who were born into everything I've had to work for. What if I'm not good enough? What if they see through me and realize I'm just some immigrant's daughter pretending to belong in their world? It was the first time Victoria had ever expressed vulnerability to me about anything that mattered. For a moment, I saw past the perfect facade to the scared woman underneath, the one who'd been performing success for so long she'd forgotten what authentic confidence felt like. Victoria, you graduated summa cum laude from Stanford and landed a job at Goldman Sachs. Straight out of college, you don't need anyone's validation. But what if Brandon changes his mind? What if his family decides I'm not suitable? What if I lose everything I've worked for? The questions revealed more about her relationship with Brandon than she probably intended. Love didn't sound like fear of abandonment. Partnership didn't look like constant auditions for worthiness. Have you talked to Brandon about these feelings? She shook her head. I can't appear weak or needy. He's used to confident women who don't require reassurance. That's not how healthy relationships work, Victoria. Partners should be able to share fears with each other. But even as I said it, I realized the irony. I hadn't shared my own fears with my family either. The difference was that James knew about my anxieties, supported me through them, and never made me feel like I had to earn his love through achievement. Victoria wiped her eyes and seemed to collect herself, the vulnerable moment passing as quickly as it had arrived. You're right, of course. I'm just stressed about wedding planning. Everything needs to be perfect. Within minutes, she was back to discussing centerpiece options and photographer schedules, the brief glimpse of her authentic self tucked away again behind the performance of perfection. As I drove home that night, I found myself thinking about Uncle Robert's warning and Maya's discoveries, about Brandon's financial troubles. Victoria was walking into a marriage with someone who saw her as a solution to his problems rather than a partner in building a life together. But she'd made it clear over the years that she valued my opinions about as much as she valued my presence in family photos, minimally and only when absolutely necessary. Maybe some lessons could only be learned through experience, no matter how painful the education might prove to be. The rehearsal dinner at Auberge du Soleil should have been elegant, but I knew something was wrong when the valet directed my Honda Civic to the service entrance while luxury cars lined the main drive. Victoria greeted me with that brittle smile she'd perfected. "Oh, good, you found the back entrance. I thought it might be easier for you." The rehearsal went smoothly, but as 50 guests gathered on the terrace for dinner, I could feel Victoria's energy building toward something destructive. She commanded attention from the head table, recounting courtship stories while Brandon's family hung on every word and our parents beamed with pride. I sat with distant cousins, hoping to get through the evening without incident. Uncle Robert caught my eye and smiled encouragingly, but even his support couldn't shake my growing dread. Maya leaned over to whisper, "Your sister seems extra performative tonight. Is everything okay?" "Just pre-wedding nerves," I replied, though my stomach was nodding. After Brandon's father gave a toast about tradition and legacy, Victoria stood up. I knew immediately that whatever came next would be aimed at me. "Before I share my thoughts about tomorrow," she began, her voice carrying across the terrace, "I want to address something that's been weighing on my heart, something about family honesty and the importance of truth." My blood went cold. Maya grabbed my hand. "You see, my dear little sister Margaret has been telling people that she's engaged. She's even been wearing what she claims is an engagement ring, planning an entire wedding around a piece of costume jewelry from our grandmother." The terrace went silent. Every face turned toward me, and I felt the familiar burn of public humiliation. "Now, I've been covering for her because I love her and didn't want to embarrass her," Victoria continued with false sympathy. "But as I stand here on the eve of my real wedding, I think it's time Margaret faced reality about her romantic delusions." Brandon's parents looked uncomfortable. Our parents sat frozen. Uncle Robert had gone very still, his jaw tight with anger. "Margaret has been living in a fantasy world," Victoria announced to her captive audience. "Creating imaginary boyfriends, pretending that the old ring is a real engagement piece, even planning wedding details around her costume jewelry. I've been trying to help her gently, but being around a real engagement might inspire her to be more honest." The lies were so elaborate that some guests nodded sympathetically. Poor Margaret living in romantic delusions. "I mean, look at that ring," Victoria said, pointing at my hand. "Sweet little thing from Grandma Grace." But Margaret actually convinced herself it was worth something. She was telling people it was her engagement ring from some mysterious boyfriend nobody has ever met. Complete fiction, but delivered with such conviction that people believed it. Victoria had created a narrative where I was the pathetic sister living in fantasy, while she played the patient, protective sibling. The humiliation was so complete that something fundamental broke inside me. This wasn't rivalry or wedding stress. This was psychological warfare designed to destroy my credibility. "I'm just hoping that being here tonight, seeing what a real relationship looks like," Victoria continued, "will help Margaret understand the difference between fantasy and reality. Maybe inspire her to focus on achievable goals instead of making up stories about imaginary men and fake jewelry." She sat down to scattered applause from guests who thought they'd witnessed sisterly concern rather than character assassination. I stood quietly and walked inside, needing space to process what had happened. Uncle Robert followed me into the lobby, his face dark with anger. "What your sister just did was psychological abuse," he said firmly. "That was deliberate cruelty designed to humiliate you in front of 50 people. No one deserves that treatment from family, Margaret. No one." It was the first time anyone had called Victoria's behavior what it actually was. Not perfectionism or stress, but genuine abuse carried out with calculated precision. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "I'm recording everything now." "This is insane." Another text from Eleanor Morrison. "James told me about the rehearsal dinner. I'm driving up to Napa tonight. No one should face family abuse without support." Eleanor's kindness from a woman who barely knew me stood in stark contrast to my family's willingness to let Victoria destroy me for entertainment. I called James from outside, hands shaking. He answered immediately from New York. "Margaret, what's wrong?" I told him everything, words pouring out in a rush of pain and fury. Victoria's fabrication about my romantic life, the public humiliation, 50 witnesses to her character assassination. That's it, James said, his voice hard with anger. I'm flying out tonight. The jet's ready. I'll be there first thing tomorrow morning. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. You're my wife, and no one gets to treat you like that. Tomorrow, your sister learns what happens when she attacks someone I love. After we hung up, I sat in the lobby, processing the destruction of any hope for normal family relationships. Victoria hadn't just lied. She'd created an elaborate fantasy positioning me as mentally unstable and romantically delusional. Uncle Robert appeared with coffee. I've been thinking about your work situation, he said carefully. Chen Morrison Technologies. That name keeps showing up in patent filings. Artificial intelligence applications, logistics platforms. Very impressive innovations, he knew. Uncle Robert had figured out what my family had missed for years. Margaret, he continued, I'll be at the wedding tomorrow. Not just as family, but as someone who believes you deserve better treatment. Maya joined us, phone in hand. I got most of it on video. Victoria's performance is now permanently documented. If she wants to play social media games, she just handed us ammunition. For 29 years, I'd absorbed Victoria's cruelty and my family's indifference, telling myself it was easier to keep peace than fight for respect. But sitting in that lobby, surrounded by people who actually saw my worth, I realized my patience had finally reached its breaking point. Tomorrow, Victoria would get her dream wedding. But she was also getting a reality check that would shatter every assumption she'd made about her disappointing little sister. The silence was over. The morning of Victoria's wedding arrived with the kind of perfect California sunshine that wedding planners pray for, but I felt like I was preparing for battle rather than celebration. I'd barely slept after the rehearsal dinner humiliation, and now I was expected to play the role of supportive sister, while Victoria got ready to marry a gambling addict who saw her as his financial salvation. The bridal suite at Auberge du Soleil buzzed with activity. Victoria's hair and makeup team had arrived at 6 a.m., a $5,000 entourage of professionals who transformed the space into something resembling a high-end salon. Victoria held court in the center of it all, getting her hair styled into an elaborate updo that would complement her $25,000 Vera Wang gown. Margaret, can you steam the bridesmaids' dresses? Victoria called out without looking at me, her voice slightly muffled as the makeup artist worked on her foundation. And make sure you press your own dress properly. I don't want any wrinkles showing up in the photos. I'd been relegated to the adjoining room where I did my own hair and makeup, with drugstore products while listening to Victoria direct her team of beauty professionals. The contrast wasn't lost on me, but I was past carings about the subtle ways my family positioned me as the poor relation. Victoria's friends began arriving around 9, a carefully curated mix of Goldman Sachs colleagues and Wellington family connections. As they cooed over Victoria's transformation, I recognized several faces from the tech industry scattered among the wedding guests. David Kim from Google nodded respectfully when he spotted me, and I caught glimpses of other colleagues who knew my professional reputation, but were clearly respecting my privacy. Uncle Robert appeared in the doorway with a woman I immediately recognized from photos as Eleanor Morrison James's mother. She was elegant and warm, exactly the kind of person who would drive 3 hours to support someone she barely knew simply because it was the right thing to do. Margaret, Uncle Robert said I'd like you to meet my friend Eleanor. She'll be attending the ceremony as my guest. Eleanor's smile was genuinely kind as she took my hand. I've heard wonderful things about you, dear. Robert thought you might appreciate having some friendly faces in the crowd today. The protective gesture was so thoughtful that I felt tears prick my eyes. Eleanor positioned herself near me during the photo session, a subtle but powerful reminder that not everyone saw me as Victoria's disappointing afterthought. The photographer, a renowned society specialist who'd shot covers for Vogue, began arranging family portraits. Victoria used the opportunity to continue her campaign from the night before. Make sure you get Margaret's ring in the shot, she instructed loudly enough for everyone to hear. It's such a conversation piece. Our grandmother's costume jewelry has become quite the family heirloom. Haven't you, Margaret? The photographer looked uncomfortable as Victoria positioned my hand prominently in the frame, treating Grandma Grace's ring like a prop in her ongoing performance. Several bridesmaids giggled, and I caught Eleanor Morrison's sharp intake of breath at Victoria's casual cruelty. Victoria, perhaps we could focus on celebrating your day rather than discussing jewelry, Uncle Robert suggested mildly, but with enough steel in his voice that Victoria actually paused. Of course, she recovered quickly. I'm just so happy to share all our family traditions with everyone. It's going to be such a perfect day. But I could see the cracks in her performance. Despite the professional makeup and designer gown, Victoria looked fragile underneath it all. She kept checking her phone obsessively, and I noticed her hands shaking slightly when she thought no one was watching. During a quiet moment while the photographer changed equipment, Victoria pulled me aside. "Do you think Brandon really loves me?" The question came out in a rush, vulnerable and desperate in a way that reminded me of the scared girl she'd been before she learned to armor herself with achievement. "Why would you ask that? I don't know. He's been so distracted lately, always on his phone talking about work stress. What if he changes his mind? What if I'm not enough for his family?" Insecurity was heartbreaking, but it was also revealing. Victoria had built her entire identity around being chosen, being worthy of love and admiration. The possibility that Brandon might be using her rather than cherishing her struck at her deepest fears. "Victoria, if someone truly loves you, you shouldn't have to wonder about it. You shouldn't have to audition for their affection." But she was already pulling away, retreating back behind her perfect bride facade. "Don't be ridiculous. Brandon adores me. His whole family does. Today is going to be absolutely perfect." The ceremony itself was undeniably beautiful. Victoria walked down the aisle in her Vera Wang masterpiece, radiant and composed, while 200 guests rose to their feet. I followed as her maid of honor, acutely aware of Uncle Robert and Eleanor in the family section, their presence a comfort in the sea of faces. Brandon looked handsome in his custom tuxedo, but I noticed he seemed distracted, checking his phone even during the processional. When the officiant asked for the rings, Brandon fumbled slightly, and I caught a glimpse of his hands shaking. The vows were traditional and beautiful, but I found myself analyzing them for sincerity rather than being moved by the romance. When Brandon promised to love and cherish Victoria for richer or poorer, I wondered if he understood what poorer people might actually look like given his family's financial situation. As the reception began, I made my way through the cocktail hour on the terrace, nursing a glass of champagne and making polite conversation. David Kim approached me near the bar, speaking quietly. "I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here as a guest rather than the guest of honor. Chen Morrison's IPO announcement is going to be huge when it drops." I smiled noncommittally, but I could see him processing the disconnect between my professional success and my role as the overlooked sister at this family event. Brandon spent most of the cocktail hour on his phone, stepping away from conversations to take calls that left him looking increasingly stressed. At one point, I overheard him speaking urgently to someone about payment schedules and extensions. The Wellington family maintained their dignified facade, but the strain was becoming visible around the edges. Victoria gathered her bridesmaids and several friends, along with the wedding videographer she'd hired to capture every moment. She had that excited, slightly manic energy I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. "Everyone, I have such a fun surprise planned," she announced to the growing crowd, "something that perfectly captures our family's journey and traditions. It's going to be absolutely adorable for social media." Uncle Robert caught my eye from across the terrace and moved closer to Eleanor. I could see him preparing to intervene if necessary, his protective instincts fully activated. Victoria's smile was bright and sharp as she continued gathering an audience. "This is going to be such a special moment," she said, her gaze finding mine across the crowd, "a real celebration of family heritage and the importance of treasuring what we have even when it's not quite what it appears to be." The word sent a chill down my spine. Victoria was setting the stage for another public humiliation, this time in front of 200 wedding guests with cameras rolling. The rehearsal dinner had been practice. This was going to be the main event. I felt my phone vibrate with a text and glanced down to see James's name. "Just landed. On my way to you now." The cavalry was finally arriving, but I wasn't sure it would be in time to prevent Victoria from launching whatever nuclear strike she had planned. The crowd was gathering, phones were coming out, and my sister was preparing to destroy me one more time for the entertainment of her wedding guests. This time, though, I wasn't going to stand there and take it silently. The reception had hit its peak energy, with 200 guests flowing between the terrace and ballroom, champagne glasses catching the late afternoon light filtering through the vineyard landscape. Victoria moved through the crowd like she was born for this moment, her Vera Wang gown trailing behind her as she accepted congratulations and posed for photos with practiced grace. I sat at my designated table with Maya, Uncle Robert, and Eleanor Morrison, watching my sister work the room while trying to ignore the knot of dread that had been growing in my stomach since the morning. The tech industry colleagues I'd spotted earlier maintained respectful distance, acknowledging me with subtle nods but clearly understanding that this wasn't my professional space. Maya leaned closer, speaking quietly. "She's been building up to something all day, I can feel it." Uncle Robert nodded grimly. "After what happened at the rehearsal dinner, I wouldn't put anything past her." Eleanor squeezed my hand reassuringly, her presence a reminder that not all families operated like mine. That's when Victoria made her move. She approached our table with a full entourage in tow. Stephanie Richardson, the old money San Francisco socialite who'd become Victoria's newest best friend. Caroline Wellington, Brandon's sister who treated everything like a performance for her social media followers. Several Goldman Sachs colleagues, and most ominously, the wedding videographer she'd hired specifically to capture candid family moments. Margaret Sweetie time for my special surprise. Victoria announced, her voice pitched to carry across the immediate area. Everyone gathered around. This is going to be such a sweet family moment. Before I could object or even stand up, Victoria grabbed my left hand and pulled me to my feet, positioning me in the center of the growing circle. Phones materialized instantly. At least 50 people suddenly focused on whatever performance Victoria had planned. Everyone must see this precious family heirloom, she began, holding my hand up like I was a prize at auction. This is our grandmother Grace's engagement ring from the 1920s. Isn't it absolutely adorable? The crowd pressed closer, wedding guests drawn by Victoria's theatrical energy and the promise of charming family content for their social media feeds. The videographer moved in for a close-up shot of my hand. Now I know what you're all thinking. Victoria continued with practiced timing. It looks so simple and understated. And that's because it's not real diamonds, obviously. But Margaret wears it every single day because she's incredibly sentimental about our family history. Stephanie Richardson leaned in with exaggerated fascination. Oh, how romantic. Preserving family traditions even when you can't afford to upgrade the stones. So authentically touching. The Wellington family friends laughed appreciatively, thinking they were witnessing a charming moment of sisterly affection rather than a calculated character assassination. Caroline Wellington was recording everything on her phone, already composing the Instagram post in her head. But here's the really sweet part, Victoria said, building to her crescendo. Margaret actually convinced herself this was a real engagement ring. She went around telling people she was engaged, even planning an entire wedding around this little piece of costume jewelry. I had to gently explain reality to her, but you know how hope can make us see things differently. I tried to pull my hand away, but Victoria's grip tightened. The circle of observers had grown to nearly 70 people now, all watching the show with varying degrees of amusement and pity. Wait, don't be embarrassed, Margaret, Victoria called out as I attempted to step back. Tell everyone about your imaginary fiancé. What was his name again? Oh, right. You never actually introduced him to the family because he didn't exist. The laughter was louder now, more cruel. Wedding guests were openly recording, treating my humiliation like entertainment. The videographer captured every moment, and I could see Caroline Wellington going live on Instagram, narrating the family drama for her followers. The lies were so elaborate, so convincing in their detail, that even some of the people who knew me professionally looked confused. Victoria had created an entire mythology around my supposed romantic delusions, positioning herself as the patient older sister trying to help her delusional sibling face reality. Victoria, I said, my voice cutting through the laughter with surprising steadiness. You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Oh, come on, don't be embarrassed. Victoria's smile was razor sharp now, sensing victory. We all have fantasies. Just admit the ring is costume jewelry and the engagement was wishful thinking. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Some people are late bloomers when it comes to romance. I scanned the crowd, taking in the sea of amused faces, the phones recording my destruction, the way my own family stood by, watching their daughter and sister being publicly eviscerated for entertainment value. But I also saw Maya filming everything with grim determination, Uncle Robert half rising from his chair ready to defend me, and Eleanor Morrison watching the crowd with something that looked like anticipation rather than concern. That's when I noticed the commotion at the reception entrance. Eleanor's smile deepened, and she touched Uncle Robert's arm to keep him seated. Victoria was building to her final blow, completely unaware of the shift happening at the edge of the gathering. Everyone please give my little sister some encouragement. She's 29 years old and still single, wearing fake jewelry and making up imaginary boyfriends. If anyone knows any nice tech guys who don't mind drama and romantic delusions, Margaret is definitely available. The laughter reached its peak, phones capturing every angle of my supposed humiliation. Victoria basked in the attention, thinking she'd delivered the perfect entertainment for her wedding reception. 200 people were witnessing what she believed was her ultimate triumph over the sister who'd always been in her shadow. But the laughter was starting to falter at the edges of the crowd. Conversations were shifting. Attention was being pulled toward the reception entrance, and I could see confusion replacing amusement on several faces. Victoria finally noticed the change in energy and turned to see what was drawing attention away from her performance. That's when James Morrison walked into view. tall, impeccably dressed in a Tom Ford tuxedo, moving through the crowd with the kind of confidence that came from being featured on magazine covers and running board meetings with Fortune 500 CEOs. The tech industry guests recognized him immediately, and whispers started spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Is that James Morrison? Oh my God. What's he doing here, Morrison Tech Ventures? Right Forbes 40 under 40. Victoria's grip on my hand loosened as she processed the appearance of a man she clearly didn't recognize but who was obviously important enough to command attention at her own wedding reception. I smiled for the first time in hours, feeling a wave of relief and vindication wash over me as my husband made his way through the crowd toward us. "Sorry I'm late, sweetheart," James said as he reached me, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gathering. The flight from New York hit some weather delays. He leaned down to kiss my cheek, completely ignoring Victoria and the circle of guests who were staring in. Stunned confusion. "Everyone," I said, straightening my shoulders and feeling 29 years of suppressed confidence finally rising to the surface. "I'd like you to meet my husband, James Morrison." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the string quartet playing in the ballroom. Victoria's champagne flute slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers and shattered against the terrace stones, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet. The performance was over. The real show was about to begin. The moment I introduced James as my husband, the reception transformed from Victoria's triumph into something entirely different. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before exploding into whispered conversations and barely contained shock. Victoria stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without sound, still processing what had just happened to her perfect moment. The champagne glass she'd dropped sparkled in pieces around her designer shoes, and for the first time all day she looked genuinely rattled. James extended his hand toward her with polished professionalism, completely unfazed by the chaos he'd just created. "You must be Victoria. I'm James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Tech Ventures. Margaret and I were married in January. I apologize for the secrecy, but we wanted privacy until our company's IPO announcement." The name recognition rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Stephanie Richardson's stage whispered loud enough for half the terrace to hear. "Morrison Tech Ventures, that's the company going public for $500 million this fall." Caroline Wellington immediately switched from mockery to syrupy enthusiasm. "Oh my goodness, a tech mogul in the family. How absolutely thrilling." Brandon abandoned whatever creditor call he'd been taking and rushed over, with sudden desperate interest in meeting Margaret's mysterious husband. The Wellington family friends who'd been laughing at my costume jewelry moments earlier were now pivoting to fascination with obvious calculation about networking opportunities. But Victoria was still struggling to process the reality shift. Her voice cracked as she said, "But Margaret works at some little startup. Chen something or other." She sounded like a child trying to make sense of a magic trick that had gone too far. James's smile never wavered as he delivered the killing blow. "Chen Morrison Technologies. Margaret's the co-founder and CEO. We built the company together, starting from our Stanford dorm room. She handles all the technical innovation while I manage the investment and growth strategy." David Kim from Google couldn't contain himself any longer. "Margaret, why the hell didn't you tell us your AI logistics platform is revolutionary? We've been trying to license your technology for months." Other tech colleagues joined the conversation, suddenly eager to discuss business partnerships and innovation strategies with someone they'd been ignoring as the family disappointment just minutes earlier. Uncle Robert appeared at Eleanor Morrison's side, speaking quietly but with obvious satisfaction. "I knew that girl was special from the time she was little. This family never deserved her." Eleanor smiled warmly as she watched the social dynamics flip in real time. "The Morrisons understand talent when they see it. We're proud to have Margaret as part of our family." Brandon was practically vibrating with excitement as he tried to insert himself into James's attention span, mentioning Wellington Holdings and investment opportunities with the kind of desperation that confirmed everything Uncle Robert had warned me about. James acknowledged him politely but didn't commit to anything, clearly recognizing fortune hunting when he saw it. Victoria stood in the middle of the chaos, watching her perfect wedding reception transform into Margaret's professional networking event. 200 guests who'd been celebrating her success story were now treating me like visiting royalty, asking about company valuations and IPO timelines while she became an afterthought at her own celebration. The wedding photographer, who'd been filming what he thought was charming family content, was now capturing the most dramatic social reversal in Napa Valley society. Wedding history. Caroline Wellington had gone live on Instagram, narrating the unfolding drama for her thousands of followers with barely contained glee. Maya appeared at my elbow, grinning widely. This is better than anything I could have imagined. Your sister's face right now is absolutely priceless. But Victoria wasn't finished. She'd spent too many years being the family success story to go down without a fight. Drawing herself up to her full height, she played her final card with the kind of desperate confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose. Well, that's all very impressive, she said loudly enough to recapture some attention. But it doesn't change the fact that Margaret has been wearing costume jewelry and pretending it was a real engagement ring. I mean, if you're so successful, James, surely you could afford something genuine for your wife instead of letting her wear our grandmother's old trinkets. The crowd quieted again, sensing that the drama wasn't over. Victoria had found her footing and was making one last attempt to salvage her narrative about my delusions and her role as the protective older sister. James and I exchanged glances, and I saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. He'd been patient and polite up to this point, but attacking the symbol of my grandmother's legacy had crossed a line. Actually, Victoria, James said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding. Boardrooms full of investors. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about that ring. He took my hand gently, examining Grandma Grace's ring under the terrace lighting with the kind of reverence usually reserved for museum pieces. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that whatever came next would be the final blow in this increasingly nuclear family confrontation. This is an exceptionally rare 1920s Art Deco ring, James continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering. The center stone is a 3-carat fancy intense pink diamond, surrounded by European-cut white diamonds set in platinum. The pink diamond alone carries an auction value of approximately $1.5 million. Victoria's confident smile began to falter as James continued his appraisal. With professional precision, the historical significance and master craftsmanship add another $500,000 to the conservative valuation. We're looking at a $2 million piece of jewelry, Victoria. Museum quality, investment grade, and absolutely genuine. The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie Richardson, whose old money family actually knew jewelry, moved closer to examine the ring with new interest. Caroline Wellington produced a jeweler's loupe from her purse and gasped audibly at what she saw under magnification. "Oh my God," Caroline breathed. "This is authentic Art Deco perfection." The craftsmanship, the stone clarity, the platinum work. Victoria, this makes every piece of jewelry at this wedding look like it came from a mall kiosk. Victoria stared at my hand like she was seeing it for the first time, her face cycling through disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension. For 29 years, she'd dismissed Grandma Grace's ring as a worthless trinket, never bothering to look closely enough to see the quality of the stones or the intricacy of the setting. James wasn't finished. Margaret's grandmother, Grace Chen, was a remarkable woman. She immigrated from China in the 1920s and built a successful jewelry empire in San Francisco's Chinatown. She commissioned this ring to celebrate her American success story, using the finest materials and artisans available. She left it specifically to Margaret because she recognized a kindred, entrepreneurial spirit. The crowd was hanging on every word now, completely absorbed in the revelation that the family's disappointment had been wearing a fortune on her finger while being mocked for her simple lifestyle choices. Margaret, James continued looking at me with obvious pride, has been honoring her grandmother's legacy every day, understanding that real value doesn't need to announce itself to the world. Victoria finally found her voice, but it came out as barely a whisper. "That's impossible. It looks so ordinary." James's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "The finest pieces always do, Victoria. True luxury doesn't need to scream for attention. That's usually how you can distinguish old money from new money, authentic wealth from performance wealth." The pointed reference to performance wealth landed exactly where James intended it, and I watched Victoria realize that her entire worldview about our family dynamics had just been shattered in front of 200 wedding guests with cameras rolling. The disappointment had become a success story. The family failure was actually the hidden millionaire. And the perfect daughter had just been revealed as someone who couldn't recognize value when it was sitting right in front of her. The aftermath of James's ring revelation hit like a seismic shift across the terrace. Victoria stood motionless, staring at my hand as if seeing it for the first time in her life, while 200 wedding guests processed the fact that they'd just witnessed the family disappointment revealed as someone wearing more wealth on her finger than most of them would see in a lifetime. Stephanie Richardson, whose San Francisco old money family had been collecting jewelry for generations, moved closer with the kind of reverence usually reserved for museum exhibitions. "May I examine it more closely?" she asked. Her earlier condescension completely evaporated. I extended my hand, and she studied Grandma Grace's ring with expert eyes. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," she breathed. The way the pink diamond catches the light, the precision of the European cuts, the platinum work, this is museum quality. Victoria, this makes everything else at your wedding look like it came from a department store. Caroline Wellington had produced an actual jeweler's loop from her designer, clutch apparently a family habit when evaluating valuable pieces. After examining the ring closely, she gasped audibly. This is generational wealth jewelry. The kind of piece that gets passed down through families for decades because it's too valuable to ever sell. The pink diamond alone is investment grade. James continued his explanation with the authority of someone who'd spent years in high-stakes business negotiations. Margaret's grandmother, Grace Chen, was remarkable. She immigrated from China in the 1920s and built a jewelry empire in San Francisco's Chinatown during a time when Asian women faced enormous discrimination. She commissioned this ring to celebrate her American success story using the finest artisans and materials available. The crowd was completely absorbed now, hanging on every word of a story they'd never bothered to ask about during the years they'd dismissed the ring as costume jewelry. She left it specifically to Margaret, James continued, because she recognized a kindred entrepreneurial spirit. Grace understood that real value doesn't always announce itself, and she wanted her granddaughter to carry that wisdom forward. I finally found my voice, feeling decades of suppressed confidence rising to the surface. Grandma Grace taught me that genuine worth comes from character, not performance. This ring represents her journey from having nothing to building something extraordinary with her own hands. She chose me to carry her legacy because I understood that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that don't scream for attention. David Kim from Google shook his head in amazement. Margaret, you've been wearing a $2 million ring to family dinners and tech meetups for years. How did none of us realize? Because it's not about the money, David. It's about honoring someone who built something real and lasting. Grandma Grace didn't need to flash her wealth to prove her worth, and neither did I. James delivered his final observation with surgical precision. The finest pieces always appear understated to those who don't know how to look. True luxury whispers while insecurity shouts. That's typically how you can distinguish authentic wealth from performance wealth. His pointed glance at Victoria's obviously expensive but nouveau riche jewelry collection landed exactly where he intended it. The contrast was now impossible to ignore. Victoria's flashy Cartier engagement ring and designer accessories suddenly looked gauche compared to the quiet elegance of genuine craftsmanship. The social dynamics had completely reversed. Wellington family friends who'd been mocking my simple lifestyle were now desperately trying to pivot to fascination. Margaret, you absolutely must tell us about your company. How thrilling to have such accomplished entrepreneurs joining our social circle. Uncle Robert appeared beside Eleanor Morrison, speaking quietly but with obvious pride. Grace Chen would be so proud of how Margaret has carried forward her legacy. She always knew that girl was destined for something special. Maya couldn't resist adding her own observation. Unlike some people, Margaret doesn't need to perform her success for other people's validation. She builds something meaningful and lets the work speak for itself. I looked around at the crowd of faces, seeing the shift from mockery to respect, from pity to envy, from dismissal to desperate networking interest. People who matter don't require proof of your worth, and people who require proof don't truly matter. Brandon had completely abandoned his new bride to network aggressively with James, mentioning Wellington Holdings' investment opportunities with the kind of desperation that confirmed every suspicion about his financial situation. James acknowledged him politely, but I could see him filing away information about the obvious fortune hunting for future reference. Victoria stood alone now, her bridesmaids having migrated toward the more interesting conversation happening around James and me. 200 wedding guests were treating me like visiting royalty, asking about company valuations and IPO timelines while she became an afterthought at her own celebration. The photographer who'd been hired to capture Victoria's perfect day was now documenting her comprehensive defeat. Caroline Wellington was still live streaming on Instagram, narrating the dramatic reversal for her followers with barely contained excitement. I felt a moment of sympathy watching Victoria process her complete miscalculation. She'd spent her entire adult life believing she was the family success story, while I was the disappointing underachiever. The realization that I'd been quietly building an empire while she was performing for approval had to be devastating. But then I remembered the rehearsal dinner humiliation, the years of casual cruelty, the public character assassination she'd just attempted in front of 200 people. Victoria had made her choices, and consequences were finally catching up with her carefully constructed narrative. James took my hand, the one wearing Grandma Grace's $2 million legacy, and smiled at me with obvious pride. Ready to go home, Mrs. Morrison? The use of my married name in front of the entire wedding reception was the final nail in the coffin of Victoria's perfect day. She'd positioned herself as the successful daughter marrying into the American aristocracy, only to discover that her disappointing little sister had already claimed a higher position on the social and financial ladder. As James and I walked toward the exit, wedding guests parted like we were royalty making our departure. Behind us, I could hear the chaos of Victoria's reception continuing without its intended star, the bride having been completely overshadowed by the sister she'd spent years dismissing. Justice had been served cold on a perfect Napa Valley afternoon, and it tasted exactly as sweet as I'd imagined it would. The girl who'd been mocked for wearing fake jewelry and living in romantic delusions was walking away from her sister's wedding as the most successful person in the room, wearing the most valuable piece of jewelry anyone had ever seen, married to the most prominent businessman in attendance. Sometimes the best revenge really was living well enough to make your enemies realize what they'd lost. The weeks following Victoria's wedding felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. What had seemed like my sister's moment of triumph became the beginning of her complete unraveling. While my own life transformed in ways I'd never imagined possible, the reception had ended with James and I surrounded by tech industry colleagues eager to discuss partnerships, while Victoria stood alone with her rapidly shrinking circle of bridesmaids. Brandon had completely abandoned his new wife to network desperately with James, his phone buzzing constantly with what were obviously creditor calls, even in his wedding tuxedo. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool Napa evening air. Mom approached me as guests began departing. Her entire demeanor shifted from the dismissive attitude she'd maintained for 29 years. "Margaret, sweetie, why didn't you share your wonderful success with the family? We're so proud of you." I looked at her with a cool assessment. "I tried to tell you about my work many times over the years, Mom. You were always too busy praising Victoria to listen to anything I had to say." Dad wrapped me in an unexpected hug, his voice thick with emotion. "I always knew you'd build something extraordinary, kiddo. Your grandmother would be so proud." Uncle Robert appeared with Eleanor Morrison at his side, both beaming with vindication. "I've suspected your success for months, Margaret. The patent filings, the way you deflected questions about work, the quality of your insights. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud, seeing how perfectly you've honored her legacy." Eleanor squeezed my hands warmly. "Welcome to the family officially, dear one. We've been waiting to support you openly, and we're thrilled that secret is finally over." Victoria pulled me aside one final time as James retrieved our car from the valet. "How could you embarrass me like this at my own wedding?" Her voice cracked with desperation and fury. "Victoria, I didn't embarrass you. I existed authentically while you chose to publicly mock something precious to me, something you knew nothing about. You humiliated yourself by attacking someone without understanding who they really were." Maya appeared with her phone, grinning with satisfaction. "Everything's been recorded since the rehearsal dinner, Victoria. Your complete character assassination of Margaret is now permanent social media content. The hashtag sister shaming is trending with over 100,000 views already. Your employer, Goldman Sachs, might want to review their community standards policies after this goes viral." 8 weeks later, Chen Morrison Technologies launched its IPO to massive success. My net worth hit $800 million virtually overnight, and the tech industry celebrated what Forbes called Silicon Valley's quiet genius. James and I graced the cover of their next issue with the headline, "The Couple, Building Tomorrow's Logistics." The humanitarian award I received for establishing the Grace Chen Foundation, supporting immigrant women entrepreneurs, felt more meaningful than any business recognition. Breaking the toxic patterns that had defined my family for generations and creating something positive from Grandma Grace's legacy gave me purpose beyond financial success. Victoria's life imploded with stunning speed. Brandon's gambling debts surfaced within weeks of their honeymoon, along with the revelation that Wellington Holdings was facing foreclosure proceedings. Victoria found herself working 80-hour weeks trying to support a husband whose addiction consumed every dollar she earned. The marriage counseling sessions she'd hoped would save their relationship instead revealed the brutal truth that Brandon had never loved her. He'd specifically targeted what he perceived as a wealthy Asian family, expecting access to money that didn't actually exist. When he realized the Chen family's modest success couldn't cover his massive debts, his interest in Victoria evaporated completely. Family dinners became awkward affairs where Mom constantly bragged about my achievements while Victoria sat silently picking at her food. The golden child had become the disappointment, while the family failure was now the success story everyone wanted to claim. 3 months after Victoria's wedding disaster, James and I hosted our own celebration at our Napa Valley estate. 50 close friends gathered for an intimate ceremony focused on love rather than social positioning. Victoria was invited but claimed work obligations. Though I knew she was too ashamed to attend, Mom posted photos on social media celebrating what she called Margaret's perfect life. Victoria's breakdown led to intensive therapy sessions where she finally confronted years of perfectionism, anxiety, and fear of abandonment. Her therapist helped her recognize that her competition with me had been displaced self-hatred, and that she'd used me as an emotional dumping ground for her own insecurities. The lengthy apology text she sent months later acknowledged her jealousy and requested reconciliation. I responded with grace but maintained firm boundaries. "I forgive you, Victoria, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. You showed me your true character repeatedly over the years. Any future relationship between us will reflect that understanding." I'd learned that protecting your peace sometimes means limiting toxic people's access to your life. Uncle Robert and Eleanor Morrison had shown me what healthy family relationships looked like, where support came without conditions and love didn't require constant performance. Victoria's genuine growth began when she stopped trying to repair our relationship for her own comfort and started doing the hard work of rebuilding her character. She recognized that years of therapy and consistent changed behavior would be required before anyone should trust her with their vulnerability again. The Grace Chen Foundation became my way of channeling Grandma's entrepreneurial spirit into something larger than myself. Supporting immigrant women who faced the same barriers she'd overcome felt like honoring her memory while creating positive change for future generations. Sitting in our penthouse office one evening, watching the San Francisco Bay shimmer in the sunset, I reflected on the journey from overlooked daughter to tech mogul. The girl who'd been mocked for wearing fake jewelry and living in romantic delusions had built an empire that would outlast any society wedding or family drama. James appeared with coffee settling beside me on the couch. "Any regrets about how everything unfolded? None at all. Sometimes the people who underestimate you do you the biggest favor by staying out of your way while you build something extraordinary." The best revenge hadn't been destroying Victoria's wedding or exposing her cruelty to hundreds of witnesses. It had been becoming so successful that her opinions became completely irrelevant to my happiness and self-worth. True power I'd discovered whispers while weakness screams, and I'd finally learned the difference. My transformation from underestimated daughter to tech billionaire proves that authentic strength always triumphs over performed superiority. Subscribe for more stories where quiet brilliance finds recognition. Toxic family dynamics get the corrections they deserve, and karma serves perfect justice with a side of poetic irony. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming so successful that your enemy's opinions become background noise in your extraordinary life. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Chen Morrison Technologies, now valued at over $3 billion. Our AI logistics platform had revolutionized supply chain management across 3 continents, and the Grace Chen Foundation had funded over 200 immigrant women entrepreneurs. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Turn on Channel 7. Victoria's on the morning show talking about her new book." I switched on the wall-mounted screen to find my sister being interviewed about her memoir, The Golden Child Myth, Breaking Free from Perfectionism and Family Expectations. She looked genuinely different, softer somehow, her designer armor replaced by simple elegance that reminded me of our grandmother. The redemption tour had taken her 3 years, the interviewer noted. Public speaking about toxic family dynamics, therapy, advocacy, working with organizations that supported women escaping emotional abuse. Victoria's voice was steady as she discussed her lowest point. "I realized I'd spent my entire life performing worthiness instead of building it," she said. "I destroyed relationships with people I loved because I was terrified of not being enough. The person I hurt most was my sister, who deserved better from me." When asked about our relationship now, Victoria's response surprised me. Margaret's success was never the problem. My inability to celebrate anyone else's achievements without feeling diminished was the problem. She's graciously maintained boundaries that protect her peace, and I respect that completely. James appeared in my doorway with coffee and Eleanor Morrison, who'd become more of a mother to me than my own. "Did you see Victoria's interview?" I nodded, feeling something complicated settle in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that people could genuinely change when they committed to the hard work of becoming better. Eleanor smiled warmly. "She's been consistent for years now, Margaret. No drama, no attempts to manipulate family gatherings. Just quiet work on herself, that matters." My phone lit up with a text from Victoria. "Saw your TED Talk announcement. The topic looks amazing. No response needed. Just wanted you to know I'm proud of the woman you've always been. I set the phone aside without responding, but I didn't delete the message either. Some bridges stayed burned for good reason, but others might eventually support the weight of two people who'd learned to walk more carefully. Outside my window, San Francisco Bay sparkled with possibility. Somewhere in the city, immigrant women were launching businesses with foundation grants. In boardrooms around the world, executives were implementing our technology. At home, James was probably planning another quiet celebration of our upcoming 5th wedding anniversary. The girl who'd once twisted her grandmother's ring in family dinner anxiety had become someone who understood that the most powerful revenge was building a life so fulfilling that old wounds became irrelevant footnotes. Some stories end with reconciliation, others end with peace. Both I'd learned could be their own form of victory.